Welcome, history enthusiasts. Today, we drift into a time long before the catastrophic events that would come to define Ireland's tragic mid-19th century, a time when the Emerald Isle, so often celebrated for its green fields, rolling hills, and picturesque landscapes, hid a far harsher reality beneath its beauty. It is the year 1845, and Ireland is home to nearly 8 million souls, living in a world defined by hardship, social hierarchy, and an almost absolute dependence on a single crop, the humble potato. For generations, families in rural Ireland had learned to cultivate this small tuber with remarkable skill, understanding the rhythm of planting, tending, and harvesting it as if it were a sacred duty, a matter of life and death. The potato was more than a source of sustenance. It was survival itself, the linchpin of everyday existence. A single acre of potatoes could feed an entire family for a year, providing the necessary calories to endure cold winters, laborious workdays, and the unrelenting demands of life on rented land. The land in Ireland was controlled predominantly by Anglo-Irish landlords, a wealthy minority who owned large estates and wielded considerable economic and political power. These landlords collected high rents from tenant farmers, who were often barely able to feed their families with the meager plots allotted to them. Eviction loomed constantly over those who fell behind on rent, a threat that could cast families into destitution at any moment. The relationship between landlords and tenants was one of survival, tension, and often fear. A family's fate was intrinsically tied to the whims of those who owned the soil beneath their feet, and for many, the margin between subsistence and destitution was razor thin. Most Irish families of this era lived in small, single-room cottages constructed of mud, stone, or wattle and daub, with thatched roofs that often leaked during the relentless rains that swept the countryside. Inside these cottages, the floors were dirt and furnishings were minimal: rough wooden benches, a simple table, and a few crude beds shared by entire families. Fires, fueled by peat or wood, provided warmth and the only means to cook the staple potato. In such spaces, the air was heavy with smoke, damp, and the smells of both hearth and livestock, as animals were often kept close to survive the winter. Children slept in these same crowded conditions, and every member of the family contributed to labor from the earliest age. Boys and girls as young as 5 or 6 were expected to assist in tending fields, feeding animals, or helping with domestic chores. Illness, malnutrition, and early death were common companions of childhood in this environment, and the fragile human body was constantly tested by hunger, cold, and disease. In this harsh social and physical landscape, the potato emerged not just as a convenience, but as a necessity. It was a crop that thrived in poor soils where other grains failed. Rich in carbohydrates, it offered more calories per acre than wheat or barley and could sustain a family on very little land. Its resilience against Ireland's unpredictable climate made it indispensable. Families relied on it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Potatoes were boiled, mashed, and sometimes baked, often eaten plain or mixed with milk, but in poor households, they were eaten with nothing at all. A daily diet consisting almost exclusively of potatoes provided sufficient energy, but little else, leaving those who depended on it nutritionally vulnerable. Meat was a luxury reserved for festivals or special occasions. Grains, when available, were secondary and frequently too expensive to purchase in meaningful quantities, yet the potato diet, while sustaining, was monotonous. Villagers became intimately familiar with the taste, texture, and even the nuances of cooking this tuber. The annual cycle of planting in the spring, tending during summer, and harvesting in the fall dictated the rhythm of life. Children learned to recognize the healthiest sprouts, to know which potatoes were safe to eat, and to detect subtle changes that could indicate disease or rot. In a world where survival was so intimately connected to a single crop, knowledge of agriculture was not merely practical, it was existential. A failure in judgment, a missed sign, or poor harvest management could mean starvation, and such risks were a constant concern for every family in rural Ireland. Beyond the physical aspects of daily survival, the social environment was rigidly structured and opportunities for mobility were minimal. Most people were born into a status that would define their lives. A small minority, usually landlords or prosperous tenants, enjoyed relative stability and could supplement the potato with other crops, livestock, or modest trade. But the vast majority, the tenant farmers, were caught in a cycle of poverty, laboring relentlessly to keep their families fed while paying rents that left little surplus for savings, education, or improvement of their homes. Education was a rare privilege. Children might learn basic literacy or arithmetic if a hedge school or informal teacher was nearby, but formal schooling was largely inaccessible. This lack of education further cemented the social hierarchy, limiting future prospects and ensuring that knowledge of the world beyond one's village remained minimal. Religious and cultural life offered some solace, but it too was intertwined with survival. The majority of the population were Roman Catholics, practicing a faith that provided community, ritual, and a sense of moral order. The church played a central role in village life, marking births, marriages, and deaths, and offering spiritual comfort in times of hardship. Yet the church could do little to alleviate material suffering. Community events, festivals, and traditions provided moments of joy, but they were always framed against a backdrop of struggle and scarcity. Life was an ongoing negotiation with the elements, the land, and the socio-political structures that governed every aspect of existence. The Irish landscape itself was both a blessing and a curse. Fertile valleys, rivers, and green hills promised abundance, yet unpredictable weather could devastate crops in an instant. Rain could be relentless, flooding fields, while occasional droughts could parch the soil. Winters were harsh, with wind, rain, and snow testing the resilience of human and animal alike. In such a world, the potato offered a reliable source of sustenance, but reliance on a single crop meant that any disruption, no matter how small, could have catastrophic consequences. Family and community ties were essential for survival. Neighbors shared advice, helped with planting or harvesting, and sometimes provided food or shelter in times of need. Mutual dependence was a survival strategy. Yet even this support system had limits. Overpopulation in rural areas, exacerbated by the population boom of the 18th and early 19th centuries, strained resources. Villagers lived cheek by jowl with little land to spare, and competition for resources could be fierce. A family might rely on a neighbor one season, only to see them fall into poverty the next, leaving both struggling to survive. Health was a constant concern. Malnutrition, even before the famine, left families vulnerable to disease. Smallpox, typhus, and tuberculosis were common, and the lack of medical knowledge or access to care meant that minor illnesses could become fatal. Child mortality was high, and life expectancy was significantly lower than in wealthier parts of Europe. Yet despite these hardships, the Irish people developed remarkable resilience, rooted in ingenuity, community, and intimate knowledge of the land. Daily life revolved around labor. Men plowed fields, tended livestock, and repaired homes. Women prepared food, cared for children, maintained the household, and often assisted in farm work. Children supplemented these efforts, learning skills that would be vital for survival. Every day was an exercise in endurance and skill, a constant negotiation with scarcity. Success or failure often depended on the careful allocation of resources, the ability to adapt to weather patterns, and the shared labor of the family unit. As we imagine life in Ireland before the famine, it is essential to recognize the precarious balance on which it rested. The potato was more than a crop. It was the foundation of society, the axis around which every decision, every season, and every household revolved. Yet this reliance was both a strength and a vulnerability. It allowed millions to subsist on limited land and minimal resources, but it also created a situation where a single ecological failure could have catastrophic consequences. This is the world into which disaster would strike. A world of poverty, resilience, community, and dependence, where survival was possible but never guaranteed. Families lived close to the land, intimately familiar with its rhythms, yet completely at the mercy of forces beyond their control, weather, disease, and the demands of landlords. It was a society defined by subsistence, where every meal was earned through labor, and every decision carried profound consequences for life and death. Understanding this context is crucial. It allows us to see why the arrival of the potato blight, seemingly a minor agricultural issue, would escalate into one of the greatest human tragedies of the 19th century. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by events, but by the delicate interplay between human societies, the environment, and the resources upon which they depend. In Ireland before the famine, the potato was both sustainer and silent sentinel, holding society together while also setting the stage for unimaginable suffering when it failed. The story of Ireland before the famine is one of endurance, struggle, and daily negotiation with scarcity. It is a tale of families who lived intimately with their environment, who adapted, persevered, and survived within narrow margins. It is a world in which life was simple in its routines, but extraordinarily complex in its precariousness. It is a world of human resilience, where the ordinary act of planting a potato could be the difference between survival and starvation, and where the seeds of future tragedy were unknowingly being sown in the fertile, green fields of Ireland. The year 1845 arrived with a mixture of hope and routine for the people of Ireland. The spring had been cold, as it often was, but the potato fields, those small, vital plots of earth that sustained entire families, appeared to have sprouted with promise. Villagers moved among the furrows, checking each sprout, feeling the soil between their fingers, and whispering prayers that the weather would remain kind. For generations, they had depended on these humble tubers, and each season brought a sense of cautious optimism, the hope that their labor would yield enough food to survive another year. Yet beneath the surface of this routine, a storm was brewing, an invisible threat that would change the course of Irish history and test the limits of human endurance in ways unimaginable to those who toiled the land. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Farmers noticed dark patches forming on the leaves of potato plants, areas where growth seemed to slow, where rot appeared to be spreading from the center outward. Initially, it was thought to be a minor problem, perhaps a seasonal variation in growth, a minor disease that could be controlled. Villagers attempted simple remedies, digging out affected plants, watering carefully, and hoping that nature would correct itself. But what they could not know was that the culprit was an organism of terrifying efficiency, Phytophthora infestans, a fungus-like pathogen that attacked the potato with ruthless precision. This blight was different from anything they had encountered before. It was invisible to the naked eye, but worked quickly and insidiously, turning healthy tubers into blackened, ineatable masses while spreading across fields and counties with alarming speed. As summer progressed, the extent of the disaster became increasingly apparent. Potato plants that had once promised sustenance now drooped in decay. Entire fields became unrecognizable, their leaves blackened, their tubers rotting in the ground. Families who had relied on a single acre to feed themselves for an entire year now faced the reality that their lifeline was gone. Panic began to spread through the villages, mingling with disbelief and fear. How could a single season undo so much work? How could generations of careful cultivation, of intimate knowledge of the land, be rendered useless by something so small and unseen? The impact was immediate and devastating. Without the potato, caloric intake plummeted, and families struggled to stretch what little food remained. Those with a modest amount of grain might attempt to mix it with the few surviving potatoes, creating a thin, meager meal barely sufficient to stave off hunger. Others turned to foraging, gathering seaweed along the coasts, roots from the fields, and wild plants that were often difficult to digest and offered minimal nutritional value. The countryside became a landscape of desperation, where every inch of land, every potential source of food, was scrutinized and exploited in the struggle to survive. Children were among the first to suffer. Their small bodies, dependent on constant nourishment for growth and strength, began to weaken. The malnutrition that set in left them vulnerable to disease. Their play became rare, their energy spent not in recreation but in foraging for scraps, tending to livestock, and helping the family survive. The elderly fared no better. Already weakened by years of labor and poor nutrition, they faced an accelerated decline in health, often unable to rise from their cots or to perform the simplest tasks necessary to sustain the household. The psychological toll was immense. Parents wept over their children, unable to provide even the basics. Families huddled together in the damp, smoky cottages, praying for relief that seemed increasingly unlikely. As the Blight continued its relentless march, the social fabric of rural Ireland began to fray. Communities that had long relied on mutual support found themselves stretched beyond capacity. Neighbors could no longer share what little they had, for scarcity affected everyone. Small acts of kindness, lending a sack of grain, sharing a few potatoes, became impossible to maintain when each household was faced with the same existential threat. The rhythm of daily life, once governed by planting and harvesting, was now dictated by hunger, fear, and the urgent need to find sustenance wherever it could be found. Farmers attempted desperate measures to salvage their crops. Fields were dug up prematurely in the hope that tubers could be eaten before they rotted entirely. Rotten potatoes were boiled into thin soups, mixed with whatever grain was available, and fed to children and livestock alike. Some tried to bury infected plants, believing that the disease could be contained. Others traveled to nearby towns or villages, hoping to trade or purchase what little food might be available. But these measures were largely futile. The Blight spread with such speed and efficiency that even the most careful efforts were insufficient. The arrival of the Blight also had profound economic consequences. Tenant farmers who had saved every coin to pay rent suddenly found themselves unable to fulfill their obligations. Evictions increased, and the threat of displacement loomed over families already weakened by hunger. Landlords, largely indifferent to the human suffering unfolding around them, continued to demand payment, viewing the loss of crops as an unfortunate but inevitable consequence of nature. The legal and social structures of Ireland offered no relief, leaving millions of people trapped in a system that neither protected nor supported them in times of crisis. Emigration emerged as a potential solution for some, but it was far from an easy choice. The transatlantic journey to America or other parts of the British Empire was perilous. Families paid exorbitant sums for passage, often selling their remaining possessions to finance the voyage. The ships, overcrowded and unsanitary, became notorious for disease and death. Many did not survive the journey. For those who did, the promise of a new life came with its own challenges: poverty, discrimination, and the struggle to find work and shelter in unfamiliar lands. Immigration was both a lifeline and a gamble, offering hope tempered by immense risk. Within Ireland, the human toll continued to rise. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, allowing diseases such as typhus, cholera, and dysentery to spread rapidly. Villages became centers of illness, where the sick often lay side by side with the healthy, the boundary between life and death perilously thin. Workhouses, intended as refuges for the destitute, were overcrowded and poorly managed. Many who sought help found themselves in grim conditions, exposed to disease and abuse, and often faced death within the walls of these institutions. For those outside, survival required ingenuity, resourcefulness, and sometimes moral compromise. Bartering, scavenging, or even theft became a necessity rather than a choice. The psychological impact of the Blight cannot be overstated. Entire communities faced the erosion of their way of life. Families that had depended on the potato for generations were suddenly confronted with the fragility of their existence. Fear became a constant companion, and despair seeped into the daily rhythm of life. People spoke in hushed tones of hunger, death, and the uncertain future. Children grew up amidst grief and scarcity, witnessing the suffering of their parents and siblings, learning lessons in endurance and resilience from a world suddenly stripped of security. Despite the overwhelming adversity, there were instances of remarkable human ingenuity and resilience. Some villagers experimented with alternative crops, though these often failed due to poor soil, lack of resources, or unfamiliarity with cultivation techniques. Others found creative ways to stretch meager supplies, preparing soups, porridges, and stews that could provide a few more calories. Community bonds, though strained, occasionally offered lifelines. Neighbors shared food when possible, provided shelter for the most vulnerable, and offered emotional support amid the crisis. Yet for many, these efforts were insufficient. The Blight's relentless progression ensured that survival was increasingly uncertain. The famine, which began as a localized agricultural problem, became a widespread humanitarian disaster. It exposed the vulnerabilities of a society dependent on a single crop, highlighting the dangers of monoculture, social inequality, and political neglect. The suffering was not only physical, but also social and psychological, affecting every aspect of life and leaving scars that would persist for generations. As the months passed, the landscape of Ireland transformed. Fields that once promised sustenance became graveyards of rotting potatoes. Villages echoed with the cries of the hungry, the coughing of the sick, and the whispered prayers of those desperate for relief. The rhythm of life, once dictated by planting and harvesting, was now dominated by survival, by the struggle to find food, avoid disease, and protect loved ones. The Blight was more than a crop disease. It was a force that reshaped society, altered communities, and tested the limits of human endurance. Through it all, families clung to hope, even as their world crumbled. They prayed for rain that would revive what remained of their crops, for landlords who might show mercy, and for ships that might carry them to a new life. They adapted in small ways, learning to forage, trade, and ration what little they had. Some succeeded in surviving the first waves of disaster, while others fell victim to the relentless combination of hunger, disease, and despair. Each family faced choices that were morally and physically agonizing, decisions that could determine life or death. The arrival of the potato blight marked the beginning of an era defined by tragedy and endurance. It revealed the fragility of human dependence on a single resource, the vulnerability of those living in poverty, and the consequences of societal and governmental neglect. In rural Ireland, every household became a battlefield, every meal a contest against scarcity, and every day a test of courage and resilience. The blight was no longer merely an agricultural problem. It was a profound human catastrophe, a challenge to survival that would leave a lasting imprint on the population and the land. In understanding this period, it is essential to recognize the scale and intensity of the crisis. The blight spread with relentless speed, leaving devastation in its wake. Families that had planned their lives around planting, harvesting, and consuming potatoes found themselves helpless against a disease they could neither see nor control. Villages were transformed from thriving communities into landscapes of struggle, where the battle for survival became the central narrative of daily life. The story of the blight is a story of human endurance, resilience, and despair. It is the story of a people confronted with an invisible enemy that struck at the very foundation of their existence. It is the story of choices made under extreme duress, of families torn apart by hunger and disease, and of communities struggling to maintain cohesion in the face of overwhelming adversity. The blight was more than a plant disease. It was the force that set the stage for one of the greatest humanitarian disasters of the 19th century, a disaster that would challenge the limits of survival and leave a profound legacy for generations to come. As the blight tightened its grip on Ireland, the realities of survival became painfully clear. Families who had once relied on the dependable rhythm of planting, tending, and harvesting potatoes now faced a world in which that lifeline had been severed. Hunger was no longer a distant possibility or a seasonal concern. It was a daily, immediate threat that shaped every decision, every movement, and every thought. From the largest village to the smallest hamlet, people were confronted with a stark truth. The world as they knew it had changed, and the struggle to endure would test every fiber of their being. In the earliest days of the famine, families tried to cling to normal routines, hoping that the blight might be temporary or limited in scope. Parents attempted to salvage what little potatoes remained, boiling them, cutting away the worst rot, and feeding the remainder to children and livestock. In many households, desperation forced unimaginable decisions. Families rationed food to the bare minimum, sometimes dividing a single small potato among several mouths. The hunger that resulted was gnawing and persistent, a constant ache that hollowed the stomach and clouded the mind. Children grew frail and listless, their energy sapped by inadequate nutrition, while the elderly, already weakened by years of labor and poor diet, began to succumb to illness with alarming frequency. Malnutrition had immediate physical consequences. The human body, deprived of sufficient calories and essential nutrients, began to break down. Fatigue became pervasive, making daily labor nearly impossible. Those who had spent decades working the fields, tending animals, and performing household chores found themselves unable to perform the simplest tasks. Weakened immune systems left them vulnerable to diseases that spread quickly in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of villages and cottages. Typhus, cholera, and dysentery became common killers, moving silently through communities already ravaged by hunger. The sick were often left to fend for themselves, as families lacked both the resources and the energy to provide care. Death became a daily presence, a shadow lurking in every cottage, field, and lane. The psychological toll of the famine was immense. Hunger produces more than physical weakness. It erodes hope and frays the bonds that hold communities together. Parents watched helplessly as children wasted away, and the despair that accompanied such loss was compounded by the inability to intervene. Families huddled together for warmth and comfort, but emotional solace could not fill empty stomachs or protect against disease. Communities that had long relied on cooperation and mutual support found themselves stretched beyond their limits. Resources were so scarce that neighbors could offer little more than sympathy, and in many cases, survival became a matter of self-preservation, forcing individuals and families to make agonizing choices. One of the cruelest aspects of the famine was its indiscriminate nature. While poverty, location, and social standing influenced one's chances of survival, the blight struck nearly every part of the country, affecting those who had relied on potatoes for generations. The poor, who had minimal resources to begin with, faced near certain starvation without assistance. Those who had managed to accumulate small reserves of food found them quickly depleted, leaving them vulnerable to both hunger and disease. In many communities, the only certainty was that life would become increasingly difficult, that the next day would bring new hardships, and that the struggle for survival would dominate every thought and action. For children, the famine was particularly brutal. Their small bodies required constant nourishment for growth and energy, yet food was increasingly scarce. Many became weak, unable to participate in chores or schooling, and their development was stunted by chronic malnutrition. Some children were sent to live with relatives or neighbors who had slightly more food, while others were abandoned, left to fend for themselves in fields, forests, or the streets of towns. The loss of family cohesion was devastating, and entire generations grew up amidst death, fear, and deprivation. The elderly faced their own unique struggles. Already physically vulnerable, they were often the first to succumb to disease or starvation. With adult children working in fields or seeking work elsewhere, many older individuals were left alone, struggling to care for themselves and, in some cases, grandchildren. Their wisdom and experience, normally a source of guidance for the community, became less influential as survival became increasingly desperate and immediate. The social fabric of Ireland, which had long relied on extended family networks, began to fray under the weight of hunger and mortality. Communities attempted to respond collectively to the crisis, but their efforts were frequently insufficient. Soup kitchens were established in some towns, offering thin, watery gruels to those fortunate enough to reach them. Local charities and religious organizations tried to distribute food, provide shelter, and offer medical care, yet their reach was limited. Transportation and communication challenges meant that aid rarely arrived in time to prevent death or starvation. For those living in remote rural areas, help was often inaccessible, and the gap between need and provision became painfully evident. The famine also forced families to make morally complex decisions. Parents sometimes faced the unthinkable choice of sending children away to workhouses or to live with other families in the hope of survival. In other cases, individuals resorted to theft or scavenging to obtain food, actions that were dictated not by choice but by necessity. These decisions, though often condemned by society, reflected the harsh reality of life under extreme deprivation. Survival demanded ingenuity, courage, and at times, a willingness to break social norms to ensure the continuation of life. As the crisis deepened, emigration became both a symbol of hope and a source of further hardship. Those with some financial means sought passage to America, Canada, or Australia, viewing the journey as a chance to escape the immediate threat of famine. Yet the journey itself was perilous. Coffin ships, so called because of the high mortality rates aboard, were overcrowded and unsanitary, with disease spreading rapidly among passengers. Many did not survive the crossing, and those who did faced the daunting challenge of rebuilding their lives in unfamiliar lands. The decision to leave was fraught with risk, and families often had to choose between staying in Ireland, where death by hunger or disease was likely, or risking the dangers of emigration in search of a possible future. Within Ireland, social tension increased as scarcity bred desperation. Villagers competed for food, livestock, and whatever resources remained. Markets became sites of conflict, and hoarding became common. Families were forced to ration with extreme care, measuring out every potato, every ounce of grain, in an attempt to stretch their limited supplies. For those who had relied entirely on the potato, the challenge was almost insurmountable. Without alternative sources of nutrition or land capable of supporting other crops, survival depended on the ability to scavenge, barter, and adapt to a world in which every day presented new threats. Disease, hunger, and despair converged to create a relentless cycle of suffering. Malnourished bodies were more susceptible to infection, and the spread of disease further weakened communities already struggling with starvation. Hospitals and workhouses were quickly overwhelmed, and those who sought refuge often found themselves trapped in conditions that made illness inevitable. The sight of children coughing, vomiting, and wasting away became a daily reality, a heartbreaking reminder of the human cost of the famine. For adults, the psychological burden was immense. Parents endured the dual anguish of watching their children suffer and facing the knowledge that their ability to protect and provide had been stripped away by forces beyond their control. Amidst this suffering, stories of resilience emerged. Some families survived by forming cooperative networks, pooling resources, and sharing knowledge about alternative sources of food. Villagers experimented with unconventional crops, foraged wild plants, and developed methods to preserve what little food remained. These efforts, while often limited in their effectiveness, demonstrate the remarkable resourcefulness and determination that humans can exhibit in the face of extreme adversity. Even in the darkest times, ingenuity and cooperation provided small but crucial lifelines that allowed some to endure where others perished. The famine also exposed deep inequalities within Irish society. Wealthier tenants who owned larger plots of land or had access to savings were better able to cope with the loss of the potato crop. They could purchase food, diversify their diets, or fund emigration. In contrast, the poorest families, often living on the margins of subsistence, had few options. Famine highlighted the vulnerabilities created by dependence on a single crop and the absence of social safety nets, revealing the systemic weaknesses that would exacerbate the crisis and prolong suffering. As months turned into years, the human struggle became a defining feature of Irish life. Communities were reshaped by death and displacement, villages emptied as families emigrated or perished, and the psychological scars of hunger and loss left an indelible mark on survivors. Childhoods were interrupted, lives shortened, and social structures transformed under the weight of famine. For those who survived, the experience instilled both a profound understanding of vulnerability and a remarkable capacity for endurance. Through it all, daily life became a delicate negotiation with scarcity. Every decision, from when to eat to where to search for food, carried consequences. Families learned to stretch meager supplies, forage for wild foods, and navigate the dangers of illness and social instability. The experience of the famine forced individuals to confront mortality on a daily basis and to develop strategies for survival that were at once practical, creative, and deeply human. In reflecting on the human struggle during the Irish Potato Famine, it is essential to recognize both the scale of suffering and the resilience it produced. Millions faced starvation, disease, and displacement, yet many persevered, demonstrating the extraordinary capacity of human beings to endure adversity. Famine was not only a tragedy of nutrition and economics, it was a profound social and psychological crisis, reshaping families, communities, and the nation itself. The narrative of the human struggle is, above all, a story of endurance under conditions that few today could imagine. It is a testament to the fragility of life in a society dependent on a single resource, the impact of systemic neglect, and the remarkable will to survive in the face of overwhelming odds. For every death, there were countless acts of courage, ingenuity, and cooperation that allowed others to continue. And these stories form the backbone of the Irish experience during this dark period. The famine tested the very limits of human endurance. Families who had cultivated the land for generations suddenly found themselves at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Each day required decisions that were morally, physically, and emotionally taxing. The struggle for survival was constant, unrelenting, and all-encompassing, affecting every aspect of life, from nutrition and health to social relationships and psychological well-being. Even amidst despair, the human spirit persisted. Villagers adapted, sought new strategies, and relied on whatever knowledge and resources were available. Stories of survival, of families finding ways to endure despite extreme deprivation, illustrate the resilience of the human spirit when confronted with unimaginable adversity. The human struggle during the Irish Potato Famine was therefore not only a tale of suffering, but also one of courage, determination, and the enduring will to live. As the Blight swept across Ireland, destroying the vital potato crops, the crisis quickly escalated beyond the realm of agriculture and nutrition. What began as a devastating natural phenomenon soon revealed itself as a catastrophe deeply intertwined with human society, politics, and governance. The famine exposed the fragile foundations upon which Irish society rested, illuminating inequalities, administrative failures, and the limitations of social support systems that were supposed to protect the most vulnerable. In this context, survival was not only a question of access to food, but also a matter of navigating a complex web of social structures, governmental policies, and communal dynamics that often exacerbated suffering rather than alleviating it. The British government, which ruled Ireland at the time, faced unprecedented challenges as the famine worsened. Ireland, though geographically distinct, was politically subordinate to Westminster, and decisions regarding relief, policy, and economic intervention were largely dictated from London. In theory, the government had the resources and organizational capacity to provide aid on a massive scale, yet in practice, its response was inconsistent, inadequate, and often guided by ideological principles that prioritized fiscal conservatism and laissez-faire economics over immediate humanitarian relief. Many policymakers adhered to the belief that direct intervention would encourage dependency and disrupt the natural order of economic and social responsibility. As a result, aid measures were frequently minimal, delayed, or structured in ways that failed to meet the magnitude of the crisis. Workhouses became a primary instrument of state relief, but their implementation revealed deep flaws. Established under the poor law system, workhouses were intended to provide shelter, food, and employment to the destitute. Yet, these institutions were never designed to accommodate the scale of need generated by the famine. Overcrowding was rampant, sanitation was poor, and resources were insufficient to provide adequate nutrition or medical care. Families entering workhouses were often separated, with men, women, and children housed in different wards, adding emotional trauma to physical hardship. Those who sought refuge frequently encountered disease outbreaks, harsh discipline, and degrading conditions that made survival within the walls no guarantee at all. For many, workhouses were a place of last resort, a bitter acknowledgement that options were disappearing both outside and inside the protective structures of society. Soup kitchens emerged as another mechanism for relief, often operated by local charities, religious organizations, or sympathetic landlords. These kitchens provided thin, watery soups intended to stretch meager resources to feed as many as possible. While their existence offered some hope, their reach was limited. Remote rural villages often received no assistance at all, and distribution systems could be manipulated or disrupted by local power dynamics, corruption, or logistical challenges. Even when soup kitchens functioned effectively, the quality and quantity of food offered were insufficient to sustain families over long periods. Hunger remained a constant presence, and the sight of long lines of emaciated men, women, and children waiting for a few ladles of gruel became a grim symbol of systemic failure. The role of landlords during the famine was complex and varied, reflecting both systemic inequities and individual choices. Many landlords were absentee, living in England or elsewhere, collecting rents through agents while remaining largely disconnected from the day-to-day realities of their tenants. Some landlords continued to demand full rent despite widespread crop failure, evicting families who could not pay and leaving them to face starvation, displacement, or both. Other landlords exhibited generosity, reducing rents, distributing food, or assisting with emigration efforts. However, such acts were exceptions rather than the norm. The power imbalance between landlords and tenants meant that even well-intentioned landlords often lacked the capacity or inclination to effect large-scale relief. The majority of tenant farmers, already at the margins of subsistence, remained vulnerable to both natural and human forces that shaped their lives with devastating impact. Communities themselves attempted to respond to the crisis in ways that demonstrated resilience, solidarity, and ingenuity. Villagers shared what little food remained, coordinated efforts to dig up and distribute surviving crops, and organized local support networks to aid the most vulnerable. Informal systems of barter emerged, as families traded small quantities of goods or labor to obtain essential supplies. Yet even the strongest community bonds were tested to their limits. Overpopulation, scarcity, and widespread mortality placed extraordinary stress on social cohesion. In some areas, disputes over food, water, or land became sources of tension, revealing how extreme deprivation can challenge ethical norms, social hierarchies, and interpersonal trust. Religious institutions played a dual role during this period, offering both spiritual solace and practical support. The Catholic Church, representing the majority of the population, provided communal organization, charity, and comfort through its network of priests, nuns, and parishioners. Masses, prayers, and rituals offered emotional relief and a sense of continuity amidst chaos. At the same time, religious organizations distributed food, clothing, and medical care wherever possible, supplementing the insufficient state mechanisms of relief. Protestant organizations also contributed, particularly in urban centers, though the reach of these efforts was uneven and often influenced by sectarian dynamics. The famine highlighted the critical importance of civil society and organized faith-based networks in sustaining communities when official structures failed. Governmental responses were often shaped as much by ideology as by necessity. Policymakers in London believed that the principles of self-reliance and market economics should guide relief efforts. Programs that provided direct food aid were limited, while work requirements or public labor schemes were emphasized. Roads, drainage projects, and other forms of employment were offered in exchange for wages or food, Yet these programs were often poorly managed, underfunded, and logistically challenging. The reliance on such work for relief schemes reflected a belief that assistance should encourage productivity rather than offer unconditional support, but in practice, the harsh physical labor required was frequently beyond the weakened capacity of starving individuals. Furthermore, the export of food from Ireland during the famine underscores the cruel paradox of this period. While millions of Irish families were starving, large quantities of grain, livestock, and other foodstuffs were still being shipped from Irish ports to England and beyond. This phenomenon was not merely an economic anomaly, but a reflection of systemic inequities in land ownership, trade policies, and political power. The very structures that allowed Ireland to be integrated into the broader British economy ensured that local needs could be subordinated to profit, trade, and fiscal ideology. For starving families, the sight of ships laden with food leaving their shores was a bitter, tangible reminder of the limits of governmental and societal concern for their welfare. Immigration policy also became a tool and, at times, a reflection of government priorities. While some officials encouraged immigration as a means of reducing population pressure and potential unrest, organized assistance was limited. Families who could afford to pay for passage might find new opportunities abroad, yet those without resources faced almost certain death if they remained. The funneling of assistance through workhouses, charitable organizations, or immigration programs reflected both a recognition of need and a calculated approach to social management, often prioritizing political considerations over humanitarian urgency. The societal impact of these governmental and structural responses was profound. Entire communities were destabilized as families were evicted, sent abroad, or decimated by disease. Social hierarchies, previously rigid but relatively stable, were disrupted as wealthier tenants or landlords survived while poorer families perished. The psychological trauma of navigating these failures, of witnessing widespread death and displacement, left indelible marks on the population. Oral histories, letters, and parish records from this period reveal the fear, despair, and moral complexity that defined everyday life. Individuals were forced to make choices in a system that offered minimal support and often actively disadvantaged the most vulnerable, illustrating how governance and policy can magnify the consequences of natural disasters. At the same time, ordinary people demonstrated remarkable resilience, adaptability, and moral courage. Villagers created local economies based on barter, shared labor, and mutual aid. Families developed strategies to stretch limited resources, preserving potatoes, rationing grain, or supplementing diets with wild plants and seafood. Women often played central roles in these survival strategies, managing household resources, tending gardens, and coordinating with neighbors to ensure that children and the elderly received at least minimal sustenance. The importance of social networks and local initiative cannot be overstated. In many cases, they made the difference between life and death. Medical care during the famine was inadequate, further illustrating the role of society in shaping outcomes. Physicians were scarce in rural areas, and treatments were limited by both knowledge and resources. Malnutrition exacerbated susceptibility to disease, and outbreaks of typhus, cholera, and dysentery overwhelmed whatever rudimentary care existed. Relief programs sometimes included medical assistance, but these efforts were underfunded, slow, and inconsistent. Families were left to improvise, relying on home remedies, herbal treatments, and community knowledge in an effort to stave off illness. The interplay between nutrition, disease, and social support demonstrates how government and societal structures, or the lack thereof, directly influenced mortality and suffering. Education and information were also critical factors in survival. A knowledge of alternative food sources, farming techniques, and community support mechanisms could mean the difference between life and death. Yet literacy rates were low and information dissemination was uneven. Some villagers relied on word of mouth, traveling markets, or parish networks to share knowledge. Others remained isolated, unable to access guidance that might have helped them adapt to the crisis. The famine highlighted how societal structures, including education and communication, could either facilitate survival or exacerbate vulnerability. Throughout this period, the famine acted as both a magnifier and a revealer of societal strengths and weaknesses. It revealed the fragility of a society dependent on a single crop, the vulnerabilities created by social inequality, and the consequences of inadequate governance. At the same time, it showcased human resilience, community solidarity, and the ingenuity that arises in response to extreme adversity. The interaction between governmental policy, landlord behavior, communal support, and individual action shaped outcomes in profound ways, demonstrating that survival during the famine was determined as much by social and political structures as by agricultural realities. Ultimately, the Irish Potato Famine was not only a natural disaster, but also a societal crisis. It tested the limits of governance, exposed the inadequacies of social institutions, and highlighted both the vulnerabilities and strengths of human communities. Families struggled not merely against hunger, but against a complex web of social, political, and economic forces that influenced every aspect of daily life. The interplay between government response, societal organization, and individual resilience defined the experience of millions, shaping the human narrative of suffering, endurance, and adaptation. Through it all, the stories of survival, failure, and resilience illuminate the profound role that society and governance play in shaping human outcomes. Famine demonstrates how natural disasters intersect with human systems, and how the decisions of governments, communities, and individuals can amplify or mitigate the effects of catastrophe. It is a story that emphasizes not only the cruelty of hunger, but also the capacity for cooperation, ingenuity, and moral courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. As the famine deepened, the people of Ireland were forced to confront an unforgiving reality. Survival required more than endurance. It demanded strategy, ingenuity, and an almost relentless adaptability to circumstances that were constantly shifting. The Blight had stripped the land of its primary sustenance, leaving families with little choice but to innovate, improvise, and make morally complex decisions in order to continue living. From the smallest villages to sprawling rural communities, survival became an intricate negotiation between the limitations of the human body, the scarcity of resources, and the social networks that could either support or betray a family's efforts to endure. The first strategy for survival was, unsurprisingly, food preservation and rationing. Households became masters of extracting the maximum sustenance from the few resources available. Potatoes that were partially spoiled were carefully trimmed, boiled, and mashed into thin gruels. Surviving grains were ground into coarse flours, mixed with wild herbs or foraged roots, and baked into dense, barely palatable breads. Every ounce of caloric value was meticulously calculated. Parents divided portions with painstaking precision, often sacrificing their own nutrition to ensure that children received slightly more. In some cases, families implemented rotating meal schedules, where some members ate one day while others skipped, spreading the available food over time to prolong survival. This constant rationing was a psychologically taxing task, as every decision carried immediate consequences for the health and strength of loved ones. Foraging became a critical survival skill. Families ventured beyond their farms, exploring fields, forests, and coastlines in search of edible plants, roots, and seaweeds. Dandelion leaves, nettles, and wild grasses supplemented meager diets, while coastal families gathered shellfish, seaweed, and other maritime resources to stave off starvation. Knowledge of the natural world, often passed down through generations, became invaluable. Parents taught children to identify safe plants, to recognize edible roots, and to avoid toxic alternatives. These lessons were often learned in real time, under the pressure of immediate need, and mistakes could be fatal. The ability to forage effectively transformed survival from a passive endurance into an active engagement with the landscape, turning even barren fields into potential sources of life. Barter and trade were also essential components of survival. Families exchanged labor, tools, or small quantities of remaining food for what they lacked. Markets, both formal and informal, became critical spaces where goods could be exchanged, even if only partially. The currency of survival shifted away from money and toward practical value. A handful of flour, a few potatoes, or the ability to perform labor could be exchanged for sustenance, creating a micro-economy entirely focused on life-sustaining needs. The delicate negotiation of barter required both social awareness and ingenuity, as competition for scarce resources often meant that fairness was a relative concept, and survival could depend on shrewdness, persuasion, and reputation within the community. Religious institutions continued to play a vital role, not only as centers of spiritual support, but also as practical hubs of survival. Churches, convents, and parish halls frequently organized food distribution programs, provided shelter, and offered medical assistance. Priests, nuns, and lay volunteers worked tirelessly to identify the most vulnerable, from starving children to elderly widows, and to deliver aid wherever possible. Religious organizations also facilitated networks of communication, connecting families to resources, emigration opportunities, and community initiatives. In some cases, these networks saved entire families, offering a lifeline when governmental and market mechanisms were insufficient. Workhouses, though harsh and often dehumanizing, provided another form of survival strategy. While conditions were grim, the provision of shelter, food, and minimal care could mean the difference between life and death for the destitute. Families faced agonizing choices in deciding whether to enter a workhouse, weighing the risks of disease, separation, and harsh labor against the certainty of starvation if they remained outside. For many, the decision was made under extreme duress, yet even in these institutions, human ingenuity manifested. Families shared knowledge, pooled resources, and found ways to support one another, demonstrating resilience in environments designed for control rather than comfort. Migration within Ireland emerged as another critical survival strategy. Those with mobility sought regions less affected by the Blight, traveling long distances to find work, food, or temporary shelter. Seasonal labor, whether in harvesting grains or working on infrastructure projects, provided limited income or food supplies, though the work was physically demanding and often insufficient to sustain a family fully. Movement required courage and resourcefulness as travelers navigated unfamiliar territory, sought assistance from strangers, and adapted to conditions far removed from the relative familiarity of their home villages. Internal migration represented both risk and opportunity. It offered a chance to survive but exposed families to new dangers, including exploitation, disease, and social alienation. emigration remained a central, albeit perilous, survival strategy. Families who could secure passage across the Atlantic faced grueling journeys aboard overcrowded ships, often called coffin ships, due to the high mortality rates. Disease, malnutrition, and unsanitary conditions claimed lives even before the ships reached foreign shores. Yet, despite these risks, emigration offered the possibility of safety, sustenance, and a future for children. Families made agonizing decisions, sometimes sending only part of the household abroad in the hope that others could follow later. Emigration was a lifeline, but it was also a crucible, testing the limits of endurance, courage, and familial bonds. The act of leaving one's homeland, especially under duress, was both a survival strategy and a profound psychological burden. Community solidarity played an equally critical role. Villagers organized collective efforts to share scarce resources, dig out partially spoiled crops, and maintain social cohesion. Neighbors supported each other in ways that could mean life or death, offering shelter to those evicted from their homes, providing childcare while parents foraged or labored, and sharing knowledge about the safest foraging practices or hidden sources of water and food. Social networks, built over generations, became survival networks, providing both material aid and psychological sustenance. Even under extreme stress, the importance of cooperation and mutual support became apparent, illustrating the enduring human capacity to adapt through collective action. Adaptation to disease was another crucial aspect of survival. Families developed strategies to minimize exposure to contagion, isolating the sick when possible and using rudimentary herbal remedies to alleviate symptoms. Knowledge of local medicinal plants, hygiene practices, and community care networks was passed down, allowing households to respond as best they could to outbreaks of typhus, cholera, and dysentery. The interplay between malnutrition and disease meant that prevention and mitigation were essential components of any survival strategy, requiring vigilance, knowledge, and often a measure of luck. Children, despite their vulnerability, became active participants in survival strategies. They assisted in foraging, tended animals, helped with household labor, and carried messages or goods between families. The skills they acquired during the famine, resourcefulness, observation, and practical problem-solving, were essential for their survival and, in many cases, shaped their entire lives. Childhood, which in less dire circumstances might have been a period of growth and play, became a time of apprenticeship in resilience, endurance, and practical wisdom. The role of women during the famine cannot be overstated. Women managed households under extreme scarcity, rationed food, cared for children and the elderly, and coordinated with neighbors to share resources. They were often the first to adapt recipes, stretch meager supplies, and find alternative food sources. Women organized collective labor for foraging, maintained communication networks, and provided essential emotional support to family members. Their resilience, ingenuity, and leadership were central to the survival of countless households. Mental resilience was perhaps the most critical, though least visible, survival strategy. Maintaining hope amidst overwhelming suffering required extraordinary psychological fortitude. Families clung to religious faith, community ties, and visions of a future beyond the famine. They relied on memory, tradition, and social norms to guide behavior, making ethical and practical decisions in conditions that eroded certainty at every turn. The ability to endure extreme hunger, disease, and social disruption while continuing to act decisively was a testament to human adaptability, courage, and moral strength. Adaptive strategies also extended to land use and agriculture. Villagers experimented with alternative crops, attempting to diversify their food sources in response to the blight. Small plots were planted with oats, barley, or root vegetables, while gardens and communal spaces were cultivated wherever soil and sunlight permitted. Livestock, where available, became both a source of food and an economic asset that could be traded. These adaptations required knowledge, labor, and experimentation, demonstrating that even under extreme stress, humans seek to impose order and agency over an environment that has become hostile. Social mobility, though limited, emerged as a survival mechanism for some. Families who could leverage resources, knowledge, or connections sometimes found employment or shelter beyond their immediate communities. Skilled labor, trades, and the ability to perform services in urban centers or on larger estates could provide a lifeline, though the opportunities were scarce and often temporary. Survival was thus not only a function of resources, but also of social acumen, adaptability, and the ability to navigate the complex hierarchies of 19th century Ireland. Ultimately, survival during the Irish Potato Famine was a multifaceted endeavor. It demanded physical endurance, practical ingenuity, social cooperation, and psychological resilience. Families had to balance immediate needs with long-term considerations, constantly adapting to changing conditions, scarcity, and disease. Every decision carried profound consequences, and the margin for error was extraordinarily small. In this context, human agency, though constrained, became the primary tool for survival, as individuals and communities negotiated the harsh realities of famine with courage, creativity, and determination. The famine also highlighted the interdependence of survival strategies. Rationing, foraging, communal support, migration, immigration, disease mitigation, and mental resilience were not isolated practices, but interconnected elements of a comprehensive approach to enduring catastrophe. Families and communities that integrated these strategies were more likely to survive, while those unable to adapt were often swept away by hunger, illness, or displacement. The period demonstrated the profound importance of knowledge, resourcefulness, and social cohesion in confronting existential threats. In reflecting on these strategies, it becomes clear that the human response to the famine was not passive. People did not merely endure, they acted, adapted, and innovated, even in conditions of extreme scarcity where death seemed omnipresent. Survival was possible through practical skill, moral courage, and social ingenuity. The lessons of this period extend beyond historical analysis, offering insight into the capacity of humans to respond creatively and resiliently to crises, to find lifelines in adversity, and to maintain hope even when the material and social world seems utterly hostile. The survival strategies of the Irish Potato Famine were therefore as much about human ingenuity as they were about endurance. They illustrate the intricate interplay between physical resources, social networks, psychological resilience, and adaptive action. Families and communities navigated the harshest of circumstances with remarkable courage, finding ways to live amidst death, to act amidst scarcity, and to preserve human dignity under conditions designed to strip it away. The Irish Potato Famine left a scar on the landscape, the population, and the collective consciousness of Ireland that would endure for generations. By the time the Blight had finally receded, its effects had transformed the country in ways both visible and invisible, altering the trajectory of families, communities, and the nation itself. What began as an agricultural disaster had evolved into a profound social, economic, and demographic crisis, leaving a legacy that would influence Ireland for decades, shaping identity, migration patterns, political consciousness, and the relationship between Ireland and the broader British Empire. Demographically, the famine reshaped Ireland in ways that were immediately evident and enduring. Approximately 1 million people perished from starvation, disease, or the compounded effects of both, representing a staggering loss for a population of roughly 8 million. Entire villages were depopulated, and family lines were broken. Children orphaned by the famine were left to navigate life with minimal support, often sent to workhouses, foster families, or, in some cases, emigrated to distant lands. The loss of life was uneven across regions, reflecting both the severity of the blight in particular counties and the variations in social and economic resilience. The west of Ireland, heavily reliant on the potato and characterized by small holdings and subsistence farming, suffered disproportionately. These demographic shifts not only reduced the population, but also created enduring imbalances in age distribution, gender ratios, and family structures that reverberated through the social fabric of the country. Emigration became both a direct consequence and a long-term legacy of the famine. Millions of Irish men, women, and children sought refuge abroad, principally in North America, Britain, and Australia. This migration, often undertaken under duress and perilous circumstances, reshaped the global Irish diaspora. Families were split across continents, and new generations were raised in foreign lands, yet the cultural and emotional connection to Ireland remained strong. The experiences of famine-era emigrants shaped communities abroad, influencing labor movements, politics, and cultural identity in cities such as Boston, New York, Liverpool, and Montreal. The diaspora created transnational networks that maintained ties with Ireland, sent remittances, and preserved cultural practices, demonstrating that the consequences of the famine extended far beyond the geographical boundaries of the island itself. Within Ireland, the famine precipitated lasting social transformations. Traditional rural life, once centered around the smallholding, family-based subsistence economy, was irrevocably disrupted. Many small farmers lost their holdings due to eviction or economic collapse, consolidating land into larger estates. The resulting social stratification deepened the divide between landlords and tenants, transforming rural communities and increasing vulnerability to economic and political pressures. Eviction, which had already been a component of landlord-tenant relations, became widespread and systematic, leaving thousands homeless and dependent on charitable aid or the chance of migration. The disruption of community cohesion, the fragmentation of villages, and the displacement of families weakened the traditional social fabric, leaving scars on both memory and daily life. Economically, the famine exposed the structural weaknesses of the Irish agrarian system. Dependence on a single crop, coupled with inequitable land distribution and the absence of safety nets, created conditions in which a natural blight could become a catastrophic humanitarian disaster. In the aftermath, there was a gradual, though uneven, diversification of crops and farming practices, as survivors sought to reduce vulnerability to future crop failures. Smallholders who remained experimented with oats, barley, and root vegetables, while the introduction of livestock and pasture farming gained prominence in some regions. These changes, however, did not compensate for the profound loss of population, land, and community infrastructure, and many families remained in poverty, reliant on wage labor, seasonal work, or migration for survival. Culturally, the famine imprinted a collective memory of suffering, resilience, and injustice. Oral histories, folklore, songs, and literature from the period reflect the experiences of those who endured starvation, disease, and displacement. Stories of courage, ingenuity, and endurance were passed down alongside narratives of loss, bitterness, and resentment. The famine shaped national consciousness, influencing how subsequent generations understood social responsibility, governance, and identity. It became a defining moment in Irish history, not merely as a calamity of nature, but a